Alright, so let's take a look at the vanishing point tool. It's a very handy tool to add textural details like streaks or some breakup and dark spots and rust and things like that on architectural stuff. Even duplicating details that are already on the image and duplicating in perspective along this perspective lines to add more detail to whatever element that we're working on. This is a quick render of a model, just quickly textured and lit and brought in here for this demonstration. So we're gonna create a perspective grid for this to help us add details in perspective. So the normal way usually you would do it is you copy some streaks or something like this, and you scale it down, and then you manually adjust your perspective to the lines and hope that it works. And you put it on soft light and you're good to go. So that's one way of doing it. Another way to make sure it's accurate and it's a lot simpler as well to do is using the vanishing point tool. Another thing we can do is, I painted the window out there for this example so that we can duplicate this feature here, the window feature, and just slide it across the perspective grid exactly where we need it. So let's take a look at that. And first thing we do is create a new layer. Go up to Filter, Vanishing Point, and up here you'll see the Create Plane tool. And what you want to do is hit the corners of your planes. So usually you'd have a contact point if this building was on the ground and we saw the ground. I made it a little bit more challenging by not putting in the ground so we can adjust our planes. So when you see red, it means that it's having a hard time figuring out this perspective plane. Because there's no contact points on the ground, it's having a hard time. So what we got to do is just grab these points, and yellow means it's almost there, it's starting to work, and then blue means it's good as far as this tool figuring out the perspective. It's not correct for our case. So what we can do is pull it up until it matches the perspective of our plane here, and then drag it down so that the lines now match the grid that we've created. Something more like that. Let's pull this guy up so that we can see that last plane in here and fix that edge to make sure it's lined up. Looks like all our points are going in the same direction, which is good. So the next thing we want to do is control click that point and drag it, and it's still not correct. So what we do is let's drag again the same way, drag it up, and we're going to drag this point as well until we match the lines in our painting or in our plate there. And I think we have a pretty good match there. So let's keep that there for now because we're going to do this one. Same thing, hold control, hit that point and drag. And you can see it's pretty close, but still not perfect. You'll see that it won't allow you to touch these kind of pivot points, but what we can do is hold Alt and click these points to, and what this does is helps to rotate the plane. So you can see what it's doing there. It's rotating it in perspective, and we're just trying to hit some of the cues here. I think we're good. All the lines are matching, and we can drag this down now that we have it. This one's covered and that one's as good as well. So we have 1, 2, 3. We can shift select and can see them all. And now that we have this created, what we can do is grab this marquee tool, and when you put the marquee down, you see how it's in perspective. I'm not holding anything, I'm not touching anything, it's just in perspective. And this is in perspective on that plane, and this is in perspective on that plane. And you can see it as I go into the other plane, it shifts perspective. So it's always aligned to the planes that I created. So if we do a selection like this for this window, we can then click copy and paste and drag that along our perspective. We can even go along this, but you can see it's getting stretched. But if I'm doing it along this wall, I hold shift to make sure I'm in one line, and I move it into place. And I'll click OK. And what I have now on that separate layer is this one element. So then I can go in and use my brushes here with a clipping mask. And just erase out what I don't need. So it blends in, and we have kind of a seamless element there. You could also do the top, but I think the top matches. It's not too bad. And that's how you can do, add details to your building in perspective. And if we want to add something else now, we create a new layer. We go filter, vanishing point. It keeps our perspective grid so we don't have to keep redoing it. So the same thing now, if I take my marquee tool and I select this guy, whoops, select that guy. I don't know why it's not selecting it. Copy, paste. I can move it along in perspective and hit OK, and we have that element on a separate layer as well. We can get rid of that guy, and we could do that for all parts of this painting. We can do it for this face, a different perspective grid for guys up here, for this guy up here, for the roofs if we wanted to. Let's take a look at adding some streaks to this guy. I'll show you guys how we can do that. So we can copy and paste it into our PSD here, or we can actually just copy it into our clipboard. We don't need it on there. We'll create a new layer. Go filter, whoops, vanishing point. Perspective grid is still there, and we can then paste it into here. Now it's pasted in, and when I go over my perspective grid, you see how it automatically snaps into perspective, making things super easy. And then I can press transform tool and scale it. Just pressing Control T to help me scale. But you need to move it down so you can see the points. So scale it down, and you can see it kind of wrapping around these forms in perspective properly. So let's say I want to do a small portion first, and then I can copy and paste that. Whoops. Actually, if I just Alt drag, I can copy it and move it along another plane and transform this guy by pressing Control T and setting it, let's say, there for this guy. Let's bring it, let's leave it down here. That's good right there. And then I can hit enter and OK, and this is on our separate layer. Now I can go back and erase out what I don't need, which is this bottom part right here. Let's grab a textured brush. Right there. Now if I move it though, it's not snapped to perspective. So you have to be in the vanishing point tool window for that to work. And I can set this to soft light, and then maybe adjust the black levels. It's feeling a little too black. Then we can also go and paint out on the top here because we don't want it on top. And we just added some streaks. So the same guy here, now he really got affected by those the black level adjustments, so we'll bring him back. Now, just for example, this doesn't look good now, but you know, something like that. And it's in complete perspective. So we can keep doing that with other elements here. I'm going to bring in another photo that I want, and I'm going to I press Control A to select the entire canvas, Control C to copy it onto my clipboard, and then I'll create a new layer. Go to Filter, Vanishing Point, and I'll open up my grids again. I'll press Control V to paste it in, and this guy should be snapping in here. Let's cancel that. I think something went wrong. There you go. Now obviously he's huge, so I'm going to press Control T to transform him and just scale this guy down. I need to see those. We can rotate if we wanted to. When it's between two planes, it starts kind of going crazy. So be careful of that. So yeah, say I want the bottom of this to be a little darker on this guy. So hit OK. That guy's in perspective. I'm going to set that to a soft light. Oh, maybe a multiply. And then I'll adjust the opacity. And we have some textural details here set perfectly in perspective. So again, let's go back, do the same thing, new layer, vanishing point, Control paste, and I want it on this guy's face. There you go. I want it on this plane now, so you can see it's snapping. Saves a lot of time. Quick and easy, click OK. Multiply. And adjust the opacity. So you can see how quick and easy you can make these things, adding details. And again, I can go back and do the same thing. Marquee tool. Grab this guy, copy and paste him, and set it, you know, let's say I want him against here. Let's put it on because the perspective gets wonky. Click OK, and this guy is already in perspective, ready to be kind of integrated in here. And I can go and paint this out. So only the top there, and then help to integrate that in like that. Of course, that red streak is a different story, but you can see if I didn't have this, it would be super easy to integrate another whole line of windows. And you can do even this if you want, just paint it out. Super quick to do a whole line of windows very easily and very quickly. So very powerful tool. It's quick, it's fast, and it's easy. And once you have it set up, you can do a crap ton of textures, and it'll all be in perspective and look right when you need it to. All right, so let's take a look at starting our final map painting by starting our value sketch. All right, so let's get started with our reference for our shot, and then get into the final painting, at least blocking in our ground and our sky. So I create a reference sheet here, and I'm going for kind of this Star Wars look, and see how a shot like this is put together. This very similar kind of two suns, but I'm going to change my lighting around, my terrain around a little bit. I'm going to try to stick to something like this, the mud kind of hut type, the same kind of textures and set details. I'm thinking about modeling and kind of something of some satellite technology, a little bit different than this, maybe a little more vertical, but in this general ballpark. So I'm using this for inspiration, and I've gathered reference on different types of lighting conditions, so all kinds of different exposures that I'm going for, and I'm going for more of this type of sunset and these types of colors than this. So I've gathered lighting around the type of stuff that I want to put in my shot. So I've looked at different exposures, and I'm going to throw a hue and saturation on top of this and take a look at some of the values and really study the exposures that are in here. I'm going to lock that up. So I have a few different options. You could go with a really bright sky like this and then a darker ground. This is one type of exposure, and this is exposing for the sky, and everything else falls deep into almost a dark shadow. Or I can go for more of a neutral kind of exposure where the sky is lit but the ground isn't as dark. And finally, another type of same type of deal as this guy, with a lighter sky and a darker ground, and with some details in the sky. So we have a darker exposure or a lighter exposure. I think I'm going to end up going for something like this, and maybe darken down the ground just a little bit. So I can do, I'll throw curves down. I'm going to sample that value and just knock down the ground. So somewhere like that. And that's going to be between something like this and something like this exposure. So it's meeting in the middle. And that's the kind of look I want. But what I do like is the simplicity of this sky. Look how simple it is, but look how beautiful it is. I want the same kind of colors, but I want to go for a little bit more of a blue on the top, so that when this light, when the sky wraps around, if you can imagine it like a sphere going above our heads, it's going to get a lot bluer. Something that would happen in reality when you look outside during a sunset. So I like the look of this sun, beautiful glow. I like the rimlet clouds right here. That's kind of the same effect that I want to put in my painting. The really warm horizon line, and it gets cooler as it goes above our heads. So that's definitely something I'm going to integrate into my painting. It's not going to be sand dunes. It's going to be something closer to this, or this reference here, type of rocks, and maybe some vegetation, things like that, and we'll get into that. So this is reference for the sky and color and exposure. I've gathered this stuff that I'm probably going to use in my painting, and this is something I like, the sun, the shape of that sun, so I might pull that element and put it in my painting. I've explored some characters interesting character, their dress, maybe their pose, riding on a camel. Not so much of this guy because he's probably a tourist, but I like his headgear and the fact that he's got travel stuff on his camel. That could be something cool to implement into our painting. And I also took this not because of this guy, but because I like the colors in the sky. The same kind of warm horizon, that rimlet feeling, and the nice blue on the top. Not so much this complicated. I'm not going to go this crazy. I'm looking for the small sun, kind of like this look in the Star Wars, but around this color range. And here's something. This set was actually built in Tunisia in the desert, and it's still there today. So you can find tons of reference on this set online as well. So I have tons of nice textural reference and shape design as well that I can base my mud hut on as well. So, but it's going to look very similar to the one that's up here as far as design. So I'm kind of designed it after some reference of that location, actual location that still exists there. And then finally, this is the kind of terrain I want. Sandy, but it's got some vegetation on it, some shrubs, some trees dried up, and with a little bit of rock. This is the kind of look I'm going for. So I've kind of gathered pretty much everything that I'm thinking about putting into my painting. I got the sky, the colors, and the exposure up here. The sun as well, all up here. I got the terrain, the way I want it to look here. The architecture, the hut over here, characters, and sky as well. So these are all the elements that I'm going to be implementing in my painting. I'm going to pull definitely from a lot of these. I'm going to be using a bunch of these skies, kind of mishmashed together to create exactly what I want and get the look that I want out of it as well. So we're in good shape here to block in our stuff. So let's jump into our painting and let's get started. Okay, so let's go take a look at our plate now. So this is the plate that I'm going to be starting from. It's a photo that I found, and I cleaned it up, extracted it. Gonna need to do some cleanup on this guy before we start using it, but it has all the things that I'm looking for. The kind of sandy desert look, the shrubbery, the rocks, a nice kind of little hill there, rocky hill that I can kind of play with, and some sand and dunes in the background, which will work nicely. Now, what we have to pay attention to is, one, the kind of colors that we're going for. So we kind of have a color scheme that we want. So we want kind of something similar to this. But what I'm looking for is, and what I have to pay attention to is, what is this getting lit by? So when you have something in this type of lighting condition, what we see is, and I'm going to grab a brush here. What we're seeing is that there's no direct sunlight because the sun is so low in the horizon that we're not going to get any direct sunlight. But what we do get is all these top surfaces here getting lit by the sky, and that's a nice blue color. So you see all these top faces that are facing that way are getting lit by that skylight. So that's something that we want to include into our painting, is that top light. And you can see that it's more, it's a lot cooler, and because it's reflecting the blue. Oops. Even here, you see the relationship is cooler than the shadow areas. Similarly here, we get a little bit of a cool kind of cyan feel, and then we have the warmth in the sand as well. But what I want is more of a kind of cool sand, something like this, where you see really reflecting the sky there, and look how cool that is. And we can play that nicely against the warmth of the sky and the cool of the ground. So that's something we want to implement into our painting, paying attention to how it's going to be lit. So we're going to have some color correction done to this. And the other thing that we want to look at in the plate is how diffuse the lighting is. So because it's, it's going to be sunset backlit, we're going to have mostly the shadows are going to be ambient occlusion. So an ambient occlusion is the areas that is occluded by light from the object. So right underneath you get this soft kind of really soft darker area which is being occluded by the object. So that's something we want to keep in mind. Everything that we import and we light to this plate is going to have that same ambient occlusion look to help it sit in that scene. And we see it everywhere here, kind of the nice soft shadows that just fall to help it sit into the plate. So taking those cues, let's go take a look at what the painting looked like when I blocked in my my sky and my ground. So here's the painting, and I blocked in my sky, blocked in my ground, added some tree element here for more shrubbery, and a little bit more of a composition element because most of the action, as we decided, was going to be on screen left. So we're going to have our hut somewhere here, a hover bike somewhere around this area, our character and our sat tech going to be all in this area. So to balance all this information, all these elements here, I decided to put a tree element here to kind of keep your eye in this kind of focal area, this general area. And you can see I have some cleanup work to do on my tree there. But let's go clean that up, and then we're going to go through, actually we'll go through the painting first, and then we'll take a look at the we're cleaning that guy up. So I'm going to take kind of all these layers down. Okay, the CC does a lot there. Let's take that out, delete that, we're not using it. Alright, so this plate, I've already graded it down a little cooler. I didn't save it in the clipping mask here, but it was just a quick color correct using the color balance. What I did though is cool down that back sand area, and it was just feeling too warm back there for the kind of lighting that we wanted. We wanted to be lit more by the skylight that's coming down and really cooling down this area, making it a little bit more cyan than warm. So just a hue and saturation shift, a temperature shift, sorry, on color mode, and just shifting it a little bit cooler and away from the warms that were there. So bringing in some branch detail over there, and then bringing it back by grabbing some other elements and extracting it and bringing it in here just to add a little bit of the tree back in there because it was getting lost when we matted that out. And a little bit of foreground kind of gradation to help kind of lead your eye in by just darkening down just a little bit of that edge. It's very subtle, but and it's just by throwing curves, pulling down the mids here, as you can see, and then adjusting the opacity to what I wanted it to be. So that was my background, at least, sorry, my plate. The sky here is going to take a little bit more work. So let me turn off all this stuff. Take a look at where it started. So I used the same reference that we were looking at here. I believe it was this guy here. Yeah, so it's that guy. But what I did like was the fact that it had some of the sand dunes in the plate as well. So what I do is, and this was pretty high res, so I can grab this entire area here if I wanted to. I'll copy it, And this is lower res because I scaled it down to fit on this page. So it's not going to be the correct size. And I brought it into my painting. Yeah, so you can see it's not the correct size. But I'll just scale it up for demonstration purposes. So I wanted the sand dune in there to serve as almost, a distant element back there, and color corrected it a little bit. And I don't think I saved it again because I think it was just a quick kind of adjustment. But let's see some of the adjustments that I started to make on this guy. So first thing we did was throw curves down to bring it down. It was feeling too bright for what we wanted. You can see how bright it was. That could work too, but I wanted to bring it down slightly because I knew I was going to grade down the foreground. The foreground was still a little too bright for what I wanted it to be according to the reference. So I'll match this for now, and then you can see up here that I did a global kind of color correct on the bottom area of the painting. So just curve it down just a bit to match the ground value, and that's just by pulling down the mids there. Then we start color correcting the sky. And what it is this color correct on color mode is warming up that horizon. So we want that same feeling that we get, something like this, that really warm kind of rich horizon line. And really warming up that area to get some of these pinker values, and almost going into, whoops, zoom out, kind of this territory where we get the nice kind of pinky fall off. So that's what I want. That's what I wanted. And I'm just going to desaturate that just a little bit. And I'm also looking at the sand dunes as well. So I'm warming that up and then pulling out the saturation. So I have this settled. I know I'll probably replace the other stuff, but I've kind of put it into a ballpark where I can add some more photos to. So the next photo I added was this element here. I wanted this, and it was just from this guy. I wanted this nice kind of rimlet look because it's really pretty and it just makes for a beautiful sky back there. So I wanted that element into my painting. So I copy and pasted that in, and that was just with a grad. You can see that photo element there, but I didn't want my sun to be there. I wanted my sun to be around this area. So I only kept the top half of that, threw a color balance on to really cool down the cloud there, and that was just from looking at some of the other reference of something like this, a little bit cooler. And if I'm going for these types of colors, I want that pink look. So really made it pink there. And what I'm going to do now is put in that blue kind of sky up top. And that was from a reference I found. It wasn't on my sheet, but it was just another reference that I had of a sky. And all I did was paint out what I didn't want and keep the rest, and then color correct it to match kind of my painting. And again, this is all going to be adjusted once we throw our sky down. These are the actual colors we're going to see. But right now what I'm doing is I'm matching it to each other, and then going to do a whole global color correct on all this stuff down here. So this is more in the area that we're going to land in. But what I'm doing now is just matching all the elements to what I see currently as far as value and color, and then do a grade on everything that's below this color correct. So let's take a look. So the value of that the back dunes there, obviously way too dark for the amount of for the distance and the amount of atmosphere that's in the air. So what I do is just grab a value here, a color here, and I'm going to grab my soft brush, and I'm just going to paint softly into my layer until I get, and I'm doing very slight pressure. I'm not pressing really hard like this. I'm just going over it very softly until I land at the value that I'm looking for. And I'll even do it like this so that I can really judge just value. My color isn't going to change, so I can just judge my values. And it's starting to get there. And I can go heavier and then kind of ease out with the opacity here. If I think I went too much, I can always pull it back with the opacity. So that's starting to feel good. Knocking it back to feel a little closer to the plate. But like I showed you guys last week, to get away from that soft Photoshop brush look, what I like to do is throw a layer on, clip it, fill it with black, come into my noise, add noise filter, and I'm just going to zoom in to take a look at that noise. And we may want to lower it, so maybe go to 15. I'm just going to see, let's go 10. Yeah, 10 feels a little closer. Let's go to 5 and see. Yeah, 5 feels really good. So that I'm matching kind of the grain and noise that's in the sky so that it's a nice seamless transition. So I'm going to click OK on that. And then I'm going to go screen. And that's going to screen it on. And if it's too much, I'll tone it down by just pulling down the opacity. And that way, it takes away that soft kind of Photoshop brush tool, and kind of gives it more of a photographic look. Because if we did have haze back there like we do right here, look at all that noise. And to blend it in, now you can see there was no noise in that, and now there's a little bit of noise to help it sit in the photographic range. But you want to be subtle with it. Make sure you're matching the grain that's in the plate there. So once we have that guy, we're going to jump into the sun here. So what I liked about this reference, I believe I used this guy here. Whoops. Was it? Yes, it is. So it matches the cloud that I'm already using, and I like that, just that tiny bit of cloud coming in front of that sun, just to break it up a little bit. And that's going to set it apart from kind of the more full sun that we have somewhere like this that we're going to use. So I pull that in and just literally paint it around it with a soft brush. That's where it's going to be appearing. And then now we have to color correct this guy to make it match into our into the rest of our sky. So I'm going to throw a color balance on. It's on color mode, and what that's doing is just cooling it down a little bit because it was way too warm, way too much orange. You want to bring it into the kind of more of a pinkish, purplish, into, you know, warm into the pinkish, warmish kind of tones. So we put a little cyan and blues in there to really cool down the surrounding, and then we keep the core of it warm. So that's what that did. And then it felt a little too saturated for what's around it. So threw on a hue and saturation again on color mode and just pulled out some saturation to help it sit in there. You can see a little too saturated and didn't fit what was happening with the rest of the colors in the sky, and that hue and saturation just knocked it down and put it in the right space for that sky. And lastly, I think I could delete this guy. This was our example. The sun. So And this was just that same element going into a reference, and you can either pull a matte out of this, black and white, and bring it in, or just do kind of a selection and bring it in and paint it. I think I brought it in with a with the matte. I matted it out and brought it in, so that way it's on its own layer, and I can move it around if I need to. And then what I did was, I usually just, to soften this guy out a little bit, would add a little bloom. I'll duplicate that layer, go to my filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and set just a tiny little bloom to soften that guy out a little bit, and we have our bloom there. So there we blocked in kind of quickly our sky using let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 photos, and then kind of correcting that haze level. And the sun is another photo, so about 5 photos to complete our sky, to get the exact look that we wanted. And the reason it took a little bit is because I liked different elements of each photo reference. You know, I liked the fact that this cloud had that rimlet, backlit kind of warmth in it to cut it out. It had really nice stuff in there. Then I liked the sun and the bloom in the sky from another photo. Then I brought in a sun from another photo, and then I wanted a little bit more perspective in the sky. My sky could have worked like this easily, but it felt a little too many horizontal lines. Kind of, there's, you know, a strong horizon line, then there's another cut line here, and everything just felt really horizontal. And what I wanted was some nice kind of perspective lines going back into kind of the painting. So that's what this cloud did. It kind of shows that, you know, there's clouds going behind and above our heads, and kind of bringing perspective lines into the painting and the focal area. So that's why I added that there. So we took a look at our plate there and how we graded it, and we're going to jump into the rest of the elements that we added in this, and take a look at different things we can add to this to make this a little bit interesting. Okay, so I can see that my values weren't exactly where I wanted it to be. I was looking to be somewhere in the range of, you know, this guy that we had corrected. So what I do is I'm not going to go and individually correct all the elements. What I am going to do is, if I'm not happy with it, I'll match everything to the same, to each other, and then throw kind of overall color correct on all the elements that are below this. So I'm essentially establishing the value of all the stuff underneath, and then when I build all the other elements, they're going to match to this. So, and what that is just kind of curving it down just a little bit to get it into the ballpark of where I wanted it to be as far as the reference that I was taking a look at. You can see how bright this was, and it wasn't nearly as dark as I wanted it to be. That the light, the exposure, which was kind of the value of the sky compared to the value of the ground. Now we have a little bit more of a value shift between the sky and the ground, and we got the right exposure going here. And that also adjusts my color, which I wanted it to feel a little bit more saturated and richer. So when you grade it down like that, you get a lot of that color back. So let's take a look at adding our tree here, which was just matted out and brought in, and we have some cleanup work here that we got to do. So I'm going to throw my clipping mask in there, and with a hard brush I'm going to go in there and start cleaning this element to be able to use it. And this guy works pretty nicely in here. And I might have to do some cleanup up here. And I'll show you guys what the rest of this stuff is as well. So we'll take these off. But one thing I'm noticing is that there's some light values in there. So I'm going to create a new layer, grab my hard brush, and since it's clipped on, it's going to be clipped onto its transparency there. So I can paint on this guy and fill in those and clean up this element a little bit. And what I ended up doing at the end too is adding a little bit more detail in this guy, so he wasn't completely kind of black back there. Usually when you, and the reason that this has no detail is because when you look at exposures that have, here actually it's in my reference, so I can pull this up. When you look at exposures like this, that's shot right up against the bright sky, what a camera will typically do is it'll literally kill all the information that's in the areas right up against the brightest part of the sky. And because and why it's doing that is because while you're taking that photograph or you're shooting it as a director or a photographer, you are exposing for that sky, which means that you want to capture as much detail as possible in the sky. So all the values of the sky get brighter, while the stuff in on the foreground or anything that's closer to you on the ground that's in shadow will go to a little to a darker value. And that's what's happening in here. We're mimicking what would happen if we were to shoot this in real life, and the values that we would get with that exposure. So we've kind of blocked in our tree here, but what we do need is some light wrap on this guy to soften out some of those areas, so it's not so harsh and such a strong contrast. And what that is just clipping a layer on, grabbing a layer off the sky with a soft brush, going in there and just painting in like that, just on the edges, so that it's not as harsh of a contrast. And then we had some cleanup work to do. So we see a lot of this stuff getting really kind of noisy and broken in some parts, and we need to go and fix that with some branch detail. And what that is literally doing a new layer, grabbing my line tool and setting it to, let's see if 2 pixels is good. So I'm going to remove the light wrap so I can sample properly, and I'm just going to sample a value that's close to there and grab and put it on a new layer. See, 2 pixels might be a little thick, so I'll go with 1 pixel, change that to 1, and just do this. And wherever it's broken, I'll just grab my line tool and just quickly just block this in like this. And this will help me kind of clean up that element by just adding some visual noise that's a little bit cleaner than what's in the plate. Oops. So just going around like that, wherever I see, and I'll sample colors around that area too, so that it all stays the same value and same color. So wherever I see noisy kind of pixely branches, I'll go and I'll try to look at the form too of how that branch is broken up and try to use it and just accentuate it a little bit. And this is essentially the same thing that we did when we matted out the ship as well, and we had those thin 1 pixel lines from the sails that we need to clean up too. So this is the same kind of technique, and it may take a little bit more time to block it in, but it's worth it because we don't want this bad noise in our painting. And it's fairly quick. I mean, you can do this quickly because it's so chaotic that you can just quickly block in some details, and when you zoom out you can get away with it as being very natural. So that's the way that was done. So throw down my branch detail again, and then on top of that branch detail again we got to do another light wrap. So we can duplicate the same layer and just clip it onto the new stuff so it matches everything together. So that's how you clean up a noisy plate there. And so we talked about ambient occlusion and how we integrate elements into a plate that has it. And what I want to go over with you guys is how we can do that. So if we take a look at here, most people tend to grab a value, a dark value, and then take a soft brush and then paint in kind of that occlusion and paint out of it. And that's my kind of occlusion painting or shadow cast. And that could work in some instances, but what I recommend doing instead is instead of using the soft brush, and I'll keep this on for example, what I like to do is use adjustment layers. So what I'll do is I'll throw adjustment layer on, I'll darken it down arbitrarily, and then invert that mask and come in with a soft brush now and paint into it. Whoops. Put it on white there. Paint into it like that. And that way I have control of also changing the color. So if I feel like this needs to be cooled down, I can pull the reds out and cool it down. I can add blues to it to try to help it match kind of the value and color that's in there. And I can always go back and readjust my shadow color too. If I find that it's too light or too dark, I can go back and fix it. So it looks like in the plate we're almost it gets cooler, but it still stays warm. So we want to pay attention to the value of it and also the temperature. So we can pull out some greens. You can see what green does is makes it more of a magenta look, color correct, and that feels about right. So instead of going in and killing the detail with a soft brush, you see we're kind of flattening everything out and we're kind of killing the detail by softening it out. We keep all that nice detail, but we add on to it a color correct as a shadow pass. So I would recommend doing all your shadow passes on the ground as far as occlusion or cast shadows, all with adjustment layers, so that we keep the nice detail and we don't flatten it out. So there is my occlusion to help integrate this tree in, and I may have gone a little far, so I'm just going to keep it to the trunk area. Maybe put it on that hill, kind of like what's happening in there. And we also want to judge our values. Is our value of our shadow kind of similar to the plate? Paying attention to that, because we don't want to go like this and then be like, well, why does that shadow look darker than that? You want to make sure it's a nice match here. And because this doesn't have anything hanging over and closer to it, it's more of a kind of small overhanging stuff. It's not going to be as dark as we have in this area. So that feels about right. We'll keep it there. Cast a nice little integration ambient occlusion in there. and it's starting to feel better. Nice. Kind of like the way it's working here. So let's do some other stuff to this guy. And another thing that I've noticed is that I'm starting to flatten out in my rock here. So if this was kind of what we studied in the reference as far as things getting lit from the top facing surfaces, these rocks, like we see here, are going to get lighter, and that's where the form comes in. So even in this kind of structure, we see the top faces getting lit, and then we have the shadow here, and that's what adds form. And right now, if you blur your vision, there's absolutely no form in this rock whatsoever. It's really starting to flatten out. So what we do is we can copy. I just took a lasso tool around this guy here, or not even a lasso tool, just duplicated the plate, but I just painted in where I wanted it to be, so make it easier. And I screened it on, and you can see what it'll do to the rest of the plate. And made sure that when I was screening it on that I was slamming it. Well, I'll just show you guys here what I mean. So I'll duplicate the plate, I'll bring it on top. Let me turn that off, and I'll take a curves layer like this and grade the darks down, because, well, what we should do is probably screen this on, and I'll keep this on a separate adjustment so you guys can see. So while it's screened, what I'm trying to do is really bring out the top lit surfaces and lose all the shadow areas. So we're getting closer now, we're getting a little bit more form, but we need to lose a lot of those mids there. So that feels good to me. So I'm going to invert that mask, take a soft brush, and make sure my color is set to white. And I'm going to paint in kind of the areas that I want this to hit. As you can see, I didn't clean up this plate as well as I could have, and that's why we're getting this nasty line, which we don't want. But what we are getting is some nice form now. We'll make it less near the bottom and in the shadow areas. So this area, you know, being cast by shadows. So we can just softly paint that out and then keep it really in just the topmost areas. And I can see that my mids are still a little high. Let's see what that did. You can see it just knocked down the mids a little bit. And I can raise the lights there. So let's take a look at what happened, or how much form this has added. So without it, pretty flat, and now we have that nice top light hitting all these top surfaces by just screening that on and curving it down so we get rid of the mids and only keep the lights in that from that reference. And I like that. And we can also throw a color balance on this if we wanted it to turn a little bit more of a cyan cool feeling. And it already is doing it, but maybe we want to go a little further, and we set that on color, and we're going to set it to highlights and just add a little bit more. You can see what it's doing. A little bit more of a cyan on top of this guy. There we go. We have a little bit more form in this now. Not so flat. And we can also, if I think there's just too much contrast in that for what we want and for the distance, I'll just tone it down. But we still have that separation there. We still have those nice kind of subtle details that we want in there. And for this guy, we can flatten out because he's further off in the distance. not as close. More atmosphere will flatten out that detail. So we want to keep at least somewhat in the foreground, some detail in there. Okay, so we're happy with that guy. Get rid of this old stuff because we redid it. And now looking at the painting, what I'm looking at is the ground. And maybe we can add a little bit of a color correct to this guy to cool it down, because I don't feel like it's matching this blue that's in the sky right now. So if we want that blue in the sky to reflect onto our sand like we saw in the reference, we need to do a color correct on that. So another technique that I like to use is, what I'll do is I'll throw on a curves layer. So it's a curve adjustment layer, and there's nothing really adjusted. I could brighten this up, and that could be my adjustment. But what I also like to do is I like to clip on another adjustment layer on top of my curves layer here. And then that what that will do is reveal that color correct just where I painted the mask in for my curves. So if I throw the color correct on now, you can see that it's only affecting this area that I painted. Now I could have just done that on this color balance and it would have been fine. I think I at first tried to lift the values up and then decided not to go with it. But you can see that even though there's no adjustment on my curves layer, I'm still getting my color balance working. So it doesn't have an effect on what's happening to this guy. I can darken this down or brighten this up and it would still do that color correct, or have nothing at all and still do that color correct. Now I could have done that separately, just kind of duplicated that and thrown this mask on top, and we would have the exact same look that we did. But I wanted to show you guys that you can do that technique. And if I did have multiple stuff on this, you know, maybe I wanted to curve it and then curve it up and then use the same kind of alpha for this and just throw a color balance to color correct what I had just painted. So you can do that as well. Let's get rid of that. So now we're getting the kind of the cyan reflection of the sky into our sand here, and it looks like we can paint into this area a little bit more. And we got our color correct there. So now it starts to match a little bit better. So we blocked in pretty much our ground and our sky and matched it to the color that we wanted, the values that we want, and we're ready to block in the other elements, which is the hut, the satellite kind of tower, the hover bike, and our actor in the scene. So all those elements we're going to block in next week when we look at how to create the 3D assets and render out lighting passes for our painting, and then bring it into our scene here, texture it up, and really fine-tune it and integrate it into this plate. So we'll take a look at that, and then in week 8 we'll finalize this thing with final touches and take a look at some compositing tricks as well, animating smoke, and maybe some potential smoke alphas in here to really fine-tune this up and get it working. So that's it for this week's demonstration, and this week's assignment is going to be the same thing. I want you guys to start your final painting, which is anything you want to do. We're going to do part 1 is going to be blocking in the ground and the sky, and that should have the color and the value set, because everything else you add to that is going to be based on the values that you came up with in your painting, and the lighting and the colors. So we'll establish that first. Get your painting to look right. Make sure everything is perfect as far as the values, the color, and your sky and ground, and then we'll put in other elements that you have in mind in week 2 and week 3 and really finalize your painting. Alright, so I'm looking for this week's assignment is going to be blocking in your ground, blocking in your sky, and your color and value, and we'll take a look at that, critique it, and move on to next week. Alright, I'll see you then.